Thank you. You can see I tried to get as many multisyllabic words in the title as I could. So I work at Merck, and we work in the Center for Real World Observational Evidence Center. And we call it real world because it's outside of the clinical trial arena where things are very carefully controlled. So we actually look at real world data and understand not disease patterns, but also product uptake and product impact. So I don't want to give a long scientific lecture, but I want to just tell you a little bit what rotavirus is. It says viral disease occurs in all kids by the time they're 5. It causes severe diarrheal disease in children. It actually, before vaccines were created, it kills about 500,000 kids every year in the globe, and about 70 to 80,000 kids were hospitalized in the US every year due to the virus. So in 2006 and 2008, 2 vaccines were introduced in the US, were licensed, and were recommended by the US CDC to be used by all children, just like polio or tetanus or the other vaccines you know about. So what this created was a perfect opportunity in 2006 to say, what does that look like when a new vaccine is introduced? It doesn't happen very often, and how would that look? So the real world data that I talked about earlier shows that these vaccines are really effective. I mean, they're 84 to 100% effective at reducing hospitalizations to rotavirus disease. But uptake still lags. You know, the CDC, Center for Disease Control Statistics, showed between 57 and 84% of kids, not everybody gets the vaccine that they should be getting it. And globally, not everyone's getting it. So we were really interested to understand, what does that look like? What are some of these patterns? And traditional days of displays of vaccination coverage are pretty limited and static and don't really show visual changes. You can't usually see them in time of context or geography, and it doesn't really excite the audience that much. So, and all of us are familiar with the access to big data. We have lots of big data available. And the question is, how can we, even with the experience that we have at analyzing big data, how can we make that more interesting? And how can we help it to tell stories exactly like what you're saying there, what you've been talking about today? So I'd like to use this example of a traditional map of how you get to one place to the other. And if you remember, before we had things like phones, we would figure out where we were on the map and how long is it going to take to get from one place to the other, and where are we actually going, and if you're in the car and you get lost, forget it, right? So, but this is what it looks like now. You know exactly where you are. You know how long it's going to take you to get there. And I think a lot about data this way. Like, how can we visualize where our data is telling us and where it's taking us? So here's vaccine coverage data. Really exciting, right? I mean, right away your eyes glaze over. It's really helpful. It's really important. It's 2015 data from CDC. It doesn't really tell you a lot unless you start thinking about it. It's only for 1 year. And they do have other ways of looking at the data. This is a state map, but again, it's only for 1 year, and it doesn't really tell you much about what happened before or after that. So we wanted to visualize this using new approaches to see what the introduction of a vaccine looks like, to visualize patterns over time. And the reason we're doing this is because we wanted to sort of show and educate policymakers about where vaccine coverage is leading and lagging. But more importantly, talking about the story, this is a chapter 1. And the later chapters will talk about vaccine impact. We're not there yet. We've done lots of studies on that, and we have the data, but we haven't visualized that data yet. And so that's what we're sort of starting to think about. And so we said, well, innovation idea would be a data movie. Has anyone ever done a data movie on vaccination? So I Googled it. Has anyone ever Googled data movie before? Well, this is what I found. Apparently someone has done a very exciting movie about data, but this is, these are 2 A's, so I think this is a Bollywood film about, it turns out I went to IMDb, I was like, this is really cool, but it's about, it's a very convoluted story, but it's very exciting. But it's not about vaccination coverage. So, we went to an insurance claims database. We licensed a large insurance claims database, which is called MarketScan. Some of you may be familiar with it. It represents the insurance claims data of working populations in the US. It's pretty broad geographic coverage. It has over 100 million unique patients. But when you look at all the medical records, it's like 23 billion medical records of patients over time. So what we were able to do, we actually accessed anonymized zip code level data for about 10 years since the vaccine was introduced. And then for each week and for each zip code, we determined how many kids were in that zip code that were age eligible to receive the vaccine, and then we determined what % of them had been vaccinated using traditional vaccine administration codes. This is something we do a lot of when we look at vaccine effectiveness and vaccine coverage and things like that. So that was actually fairly straightforward for us to do. But we didn't know how to visualize that. That was something new to Merck. So with already 40,000 zip codes and 52 weeks per year and 10 years of observation, we jumped up to 20 million data points. And so we're trying to figure out how to visualize that. And actually put it on an internet interface where people can look at it and understand what the story is. So we tried to do this in, like I said, like a movie with a playhead and animate things and use color changes to show when particular vaccine thresholds were covered. So like when you reached 0 or 50 or 100%, the color would then change in that geographic unit. Now listen, I'm not a developer, okay, I'm an epidemiologist, but we did work with developers and they use different approaches. One of the prototypes used Mapbox using vector tiles, and the other one used D3. Really cool stuff behind the scenes we can talk about later. So we have 2 prototype versions that show vaccine coverage over time at different geographic units. And these visualizations I'll show them to you, they're functional, but we still are tweaking things, and we especially are concerned about some of the data, underlying data sets, so we're still working on that part of it. So here's one of the first ones, and this is showing at the state level. When you click on the bottom, if you can see the timeline, this is when the vaccine was introduced, and nothing's happening until very quickly you start to see which states are taking up the vaccine more quickly as they get darker, and you can see which states are lagging, which ones are leading. This is something that hadn't been done before, compared to that chart I showed you where you just had 1 year, for example. And if you just take a freeze frame in 2009, you see something interesting here. The story here is that Alabama, which is a surprise to me, was one of the first states to get quick uptake compared to some of the other neighbors like Wyoming. The arrow is pointing to the Gulf of Mexico, by the way. I realized that, sorry. Okay, so we are also able to animate that at the county level, and this is something even more granular that's been done that hasn't been done in the past. And again, the same color scheme, but now we're looking, instead of the states, which are not homogeneous units, right? They have counties in them with different uptake, and you can see that even in places like Alabama, there's diversity. I mean, you'd expect that, but we were not able to visualize that before. And so what's happening in these individual counties is sort of interesting to people who are interested in vaccination uptake, right? And then finally, because we had the zip code level data, we wanted to see what that looked like. And this is a more challenging one because you're only talking about geographic centroids, so each zip code is mapped to the dot in the middle of the zip code. But we were able to show patterns over time where there's the darkening densities showing you clearly the cities that are getting uptake. And then as you move the map, and as you zoom in, you can zoom in on the individual places, and you can actually look at individual zip codes to geographic boundaries. So as you zoom in, the tiles that are brought up are different. And here, because we have so much data, we only did data at binary, so high and low coverage versus that huge scale that we showed because there's so much data that we're trying to serve up. So, that was one thing and it worked pretty well, but now we wanted to sort of, how do we tell the story? And so we created a thing that when you go to the website, it says, tells you the story, it frames it up. What does uptake of a new vaccine look like? So you go to this website and it tells you a little bit about the project and why we're doing it. And then as you zoom in, here we use a different color scale going from lighter to darker, but it's different colors. And again, you can zoom in at the county level. So when you click on top, it tells you what month we're in. And as you progress through, you see the zip codes change in colors. And again, I'm not showing them now because we don't have enough time, but you can do this by state and county as well. And then we added, and apologize for the bottom, people who can't see the bottom, we added a national trend line. So not only are you seeing individual zip codes changing, but you can see the national trend. And if you want to, you can pop in and look at individual zip code, what's happening in each zip code. So this is to help explore the data if you want to do that. And then, because we wanted to help tell the story, we said, let's focus on little vignettes within the data. And so we said, if you want to look at vaccination coverage over time, we created this little story here about what happens when you look over time, and you can actually pick a specific state. So you're not lost in the whole map. You can go down and look at West Virginia. And what we noticed in West Virginia, for example, was there were persistent areas that were being under-vaccinated. And those happened to fall in the Appalachian region. And then the other vignette we created was, comparing across geography. So rather than, again, looking at the whole map, you can pick 2 states, and like I showed you earlier, we had this example of Alabama, which took up the vaccine fairly quickly, compared to another state where it didn't happen as fast. And again, this is more, you can do this in an animated way. It's running a little slow right now, even though this is a video. But the point is, we try to pre-created little stories to highlight certain things in the data for people. So as a scientist, you always need to talk about limitations. And these are private insurance claims databases. They don't represent everyone. And the other thing that we are really cognizant of is, even though we started off with thousands and thousands of data points, when you start slicing by the zip code level and county level, and specifically we're looking at week intervals of snapshots, you get very sparse data. We're talking about kids in the data set. And so some of these there's a lot of variability. And so we're a little bit concerned about how representative these samples are, and we're working on that. For example, using geographic smoothing techniques and other statistical methods that we're still working on. So what are the next steps? Well, we'd always like to get more data to include other populations that I mentioned to you. And specifically, there are state immunization registries that are really data rich, but they're not linked together. So how do we access that, and how can we look at that for more geographic data? But that creates challenges, as you can guess, talking about scraping. How do you standardize those things, right? And how do you get that access? We're also interested in social media sentiment or human sentiment. We know that people tweet or they have sentiment about vaccination. Some people have strong feelings about it. Does that affect coverage, like the map that I showed you? Can you overlay those things? That would be really interesting to see. We don't know, but that's something we'd like to explore. But we want to make appropriate comparisons. So this is a map, and you'd be very tempted to say, that's interesting. Let's compare what's happening here to what's happening to vaccination. But it turns out that this is where La La Land is liked the most. This is a New York Times article that came out a few days ago. So obviously it wouldn't make sense to compare, I'm being silly obviously, to compare this to the vaccination uptake, but we need to be careful. But we could look at things like demographics, education, income, and other things that are available in census tracts that can be linked to this data. Here's a cool example from the Wall Street Journal in 2015, which is now getting into the next story. What do we do with the uptake data we have? How can we show vaccine impact? And we've done a lot of studies at Merck on vaccine impact, and I can show you the data slides for that, but that's generated towards the scientific audience, right? But what the Wall Street Journal did is they accessed data. They looked at the 1930s, 40s, and 50s for the measles vaccine, and each dot represents cases per 100,000. And they drew a line when the vaccine was introduced, and you see the dramatic drop-off in cases per 100,000 when the vaccine is introduced. That's a very powerful visual, and we're thinking about how can we communicate this kinds of data for vaccine impact, because vaccines are one of the most important public health interventions that ever have been developed. And how can you communicate that story on a more visual, impactful basis? So that's what we're working on now. And so I just wanted to tell you that we work on this web-based platform to help visualize data in a new way. It's new for Merck anyway. And to visualize these uptakes in temporal patterns and geospatial patterns in vaccine uptake. And then future work would linking that uptake and patterns and uptake to patterns in public health impact. So that's what we're kind of excited about. So thanks very much for your time. Just wanted to quickly acknowledge people that I work with, but we've been working with Development Seed and Access Maps, two groups that helped us with the visualization. They've really done amazing work. Thanks.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Chris. This next and final short story speaker is someone I'm pretty excited to introduce to you all. So